Hey Chris, how are you doing? So, what do you make of
I'm,
the announcement today?
it's fantastic news. We have a new Pi number 5. So it's always great to see a new Raspberry Pi.
Is there anything specific that you're excited about with this release?
I think the interesting thing about the Pi 5 is that I've looked at lots of SBCs. This is my 60th SBC. And normally you look at an SBC and you go, oh, it's that feature or that feature that leaps out at you. And this board is slightly different because you straight away see it's got a more powerful processor, it's got a more powerful GPU. But beyond that, it's not immediately obvious why this is an innovation. You have to think about it a bit. I call it the cerebral Pi, because a lot of what they're doing here is to focus on removing bottlenecks in input-output for all the connectivity, which is one of the things that a lot of SBC manufacturers don't do. They give us lots of features, but they don't work terribly well. And this board is really focused on saying all the features on the board are going to work really, really well. And I think that's a very interesting approach. But it does mean, I think when people first see this, you have to think about it a bit, and you go, that's quite a clever Pi.
And I mean, one of the reasons I reached out to you to have a conversation about the Raspberry Pi 5 is, as you've said, you've tested over 60 now single board computers. So how does this one stack up, do you think? Obviously, you've probably not had time to compare it against all the other 59 boards that are out there, but I guess you've had a cursory look and had a bit of an idea and a feel for it.
Indeed, you're capturing me mid-testing. I've been filming it a lot. I'm now moving on to the software side of things. And I mean, the first thing is the actual experience of using it is very good. The desktop experience is very, very fluid. It just works. If you want to open up a web browser and open up multiple tabs and play video and stuff, it just works the way that we've always hoped it would, but it now really does. And I think one of the things that we have in really here is a board focused around connectivity. As I just said, we've got the new MIPI transceivers, so the opportunity to use cameras with a greater bandwidth is going to be very, very interesting. Even you can use 2 LCD displays. You can see this in many more mobile devices and edge devices because you've got that connectivity. We've got the PCIe connector, which is not that fast. It's PCIe 2.01 lane, so that's up to about 500 megabytes a second. In practice, probably close to 400, but it's still very good connectivity to have. So I think this is going to be a board that's defined two ways. One, for the enthusiasts who want to use a Pi, the desktop experience is now so much better. And it wasn't bad at a Pi 4. But the other way on, for people who want to connect this to things with a lot of bandwidth, that's also going to be there as well. So, you can imagine this with 2 cameras linked up to sort of storage as well, being used in all sorts of robot and edge type scenarios. So it's got an exciting future, I think.
And one of the interesting things when you first boot it up is it gives you an option, doesn't it, between Chromium, the browser, and Firefox. So I understand there's been quite a bit of work in the background to get all the video codecs working with the new VidCore 7 core, and also just with Firefox to give you that edge. And I did a quick cursory loading up of my own YouTube channel on there just to see how that plays, and it plays very, very well, full screen. And even the transition between full screen and regular screen look quite seamless. So yeah, it doesn't seem to struggle quite as much as it did.
That's very obvious, isn't it? It not only does it play video well, you don't have that thing of, I'm going to go full screen now, and on most single board computers, you wait 30 seconds, and this one just gets there. You've got maybe a second or two, but the experience is like using, I'm going to say, a normal computer, another type of computer. So this is really giving an ARM desktop experience like we haven't had, certainly on a Pi before, on many boards before, to be honest. And I think it is because they're thinking about bottlenecks about this board. It's really, fixing everything that could slow it down, which is clearly a sensible thing to do.
Yeah, and I was talking to the techie guys, the boffins, as I recall, as I refer to them at Raspberry Pi, and they've been working on bringing Bookworm OS, so the latest version of Debian OS, to Raspberry Pi. Because it's been quite a while since we've had an update on that. I think it was frozen in May, and we're here in late September.
Yeah, that's right.
And and I understand one of the big changes there, and it's subtle, but you can see it on the user interface, is it uses this Wayfire, the Wayland-based user interface. So I noticed when you open and close windows, you get this sort of subtle zoom and shadow effect on there. And I understand it's at least 2 times faster than the previous desktop interface, which was X-based, wasn't it? Can't remember the name of it now. Mutter or something like that.
Mutter,
This
yes,
one,
yes.
yeah, that's it. Yeah, and this one is Wayfire Wayland based. So yeah, that's going to be an interesting thing to see. Does that actually break anything? Is there any other apps that we use? It's typically things like you're writing a Python program, isn't it? And then you try and use something that worked fine last time, and then all of a sudden that doesn't work anymore, and you have to play with it a bit to get that to work. So yeah, the PCI Express, I think, so we had PCI Express on the compute module dev board.
That's right, yeah.
But it was quite niche. I think there's probably only Jeff Geerling who probably used that in anger. But this is really going to open it up to everyone, I guess, because it's now built onto the standard board. So have you any thoughts about how that might be possibly used?
I mean, I understand that there will be an official M.2 hat for the Pi 5, and that's the way I think most people will use it. I can imagine many manufacturers, third parties, getting hold of these and going, right, we're going to make a Pi case with an M.2 slot in the case. You can even imagine one, because it'll collect by the ribbon cable, you could have a little sort of bay on the bottom of the case with a little door like you have on a mini PC or something. So I think it opens up a lot of possibilities, having a connector here, a PCIe connector, rather than M.2 connector. If it was just an M.2 connector, and we've seen those on so many SBCs of this size, and they stick out that way, and what do? You know, there's no you've got to use an adapter board anyway, but you've constrained it by making an M.2 board adapter. I think it's been very sensible to actually make it a ribbon cable connector, which goes out to something, accepting you will need that adapter. And there will be people trying to use GPUs as well. I don't know if that'll work or not, but there will be people, I'm sure, attempting that.
So on one of your latest videos, and if anybody, if by chance hasn't heard of Chris before and hasn't obviously subscribed to his channel, do that right away now. Obviously pause this video first, then subscribe, and then come back here. But yes, you did the Orange Pi 2, was it? And that had an M.2 connector on, didn't it, I think?
Yes, the Orange Pi 3B, that's got it. 3B. And that's got an M.2 connector with exactly the same interface as the Pi 4, PCIe 2.0 one lane. So that gave us, I think it was 346 megabytes a second on the SSD. I would imagine we'll get something pretty similar in practice on the Pi. So it's which would be nice to have. It's the one thing we don't have here. I mean, this is a Pi which is, an eMMC free zone, isn't it? We don't have eMMC on board. We don't have an eMMC slot. There are going to be discussions about that, as it were, which is, I have no problems with the microSD card, but I know some people like to see something else. And of course, the microSD card slot on this is faster, so it's, we've got some improvement there.
Yeah, I understand, at least twice as fast, but with a compatible card. I think it's to do with the card as well, isn't it? They have to.
It has to be a UHS-1 card, and it's a test I've yet to run, but the stuff is all around me here to do it. By the time people watch my Pi 5 video, I will have run the tests.
That was one of the points I've got on my list of things to talk about there. The SD card speed and the branded active cooling fan. This is a really nice laser etched logo on this new fan. So yeah,
indeed.
How have you found that compared to, say, other SBC fans?
It's a very nice little fan. I mean, I think it has two advantages. One is the fact it is speed controlled, and it looks like temperature controlled because there's a 4-pin connector, which would suggest all that's going on. And so that means the fan isn't on all the time. And also it seems to be of a decent quality that you don't get too much noise from it. When you first boot this up, it goes, and you go, oh no. And then it actually goes down to a lower speed. And in fact, I thought it wasn't on this afternoon, and it was going very slowly. So they've done a very good job of the cooling solution on this. Having said that, there will be people, I'm sure, in the third-party marketplace making passive cooling for this board. It has to be a possibility, I would have thought.
There'll be two things that there'll be a race for. One is, how fast can you overclock this? And then the second one was, how soon before there's a Raspberry Pi in space? Is it by the end of the year, or is it going to be into next year? Let's see how quickly one ends up in space.
We can launch them, yes.
Yeah, that's right, yes. Obviously, the biggest feature on the Raspberry Pi 5 is obviously the off button. So this is a new feature, not just a switch, but it's actually a soft power off because of the new power management chip that's on there.
Yes, and we've also, of course, got the real-time clock battery connector.
Yes.
That is so handy if you're doing something, say taking pictures on a board which isn't connected to the internet to get the time. You can have something you can use as your file name without having to know it's going to be reset every time the Pi resets. And of course, you might want the time as well. But things like that make such a difference. Having these extra connectors.
And the third JST connector that's on there is the UART connector. I'm actually not too sure what the intention behind that is. I mean, I've used UART on quite a few projects on my own, but
debugging, isn't it, and that sort of stuff. So it's if you happen to need to do that, you have your UART connector.
So personally, as a maker who likes to make robots and things with multiple cameras on it, that's very exciting that I can now do like stereo vision. Potentially use that in like with ROS, the robot operating system. So that's something I'm excited about. And the new sort of speed bump that this gate gives us means that Python will run quicker, and therefore machine learning models will be quicker, as well as just general any kind of like large language model that you might try and run on the Raspberry Pi 5.
Yeah. We've got a new signal processor in the GPU for cameras as well, haven't we? So you've got better processing in the GPU, and you've got the faster MIPI transceivers as well. So the whole pipeline from camera into processing through to the CPU all the way through is faster. So there'll be lots of vision stuff done with this board.
Yeah, the VidCore 7, I think it's 800 megahertz. So that's had like a 300 megahertz bump from 500 on the previous generation. So yeah, there's so many layers of improvements on the Pi 5 over the 4. And I understand, I asked Eben in the interview about how would this impact, production? Are they going to sort of cannibalize their Pi 4 production to make more Pi 5s? And apparently no, they're going to have extra capacity so they can make more Raspberry Pis in general, which is just generally a good thing, because there's been a bit of a drought, hasn't there, over the past couple of years. And Eben was telling me that it's the production, that the actual amount of money that was spent on producing the RP1 chip, which we'll talk about, was over a £25 million alone just on developing that RP1 chip. Wow. And he said if you look on a Raspberry Pi Pico, which I probably would have to hand somewhere here, that's actually called the RP2 chip. So the RP1 chip was actually developed before the Raspberry Pi Pico chip, which I didn't know. It's just that they've been working on it so long, it was easier to get this one out the door than the Raspberry Pi 5's chip. And something that's probably more relevant to people who are into computer science is this RP1 chip isn't the main processor, is it? It's the south bridge. So the north bridge is
it handles the input-output of the system, and then the processor gets on with other stuff. So it's you don't get the bottlenecks.
As I understand, that's quite a modern way of separating out the chips on single board computers. Rather than stacking everything on one single system on a chip, you do sort of try and separate out all the responsibilities and have them more dedicated.
It's an interesting back and forth, isn't it? Because if you look at desktop, of course, we've gone from having North Bridge and South Bridge and the processor to having just a South Bridge effectively, and pushing more and more onto the processor itself. And yet with SBCs, we're going a bit the other way, because we're still at the point where the processor gets overloaded, and therefore if you can give it a separate processor to handle separate chip to handle I/O, and you get better performance. So there's always going to be a balance there. And you do wonder if that chip will appear on other boards as well, don't you, from other manufacturers? Will it be controlled by Raspberry Pi? All sorts of questions there.
It does show a direction of travel. They wouldn't really be drawn on this, but I guess that it's ultimately the thing to do would be to have a chip that's completely designed by them, so it's not necessarily a Broadcom chip that they've worked with. It's all their own silicon, but I guess that's quite an investment in time and design to do specifically that. But it's interesting now that they've got this RP1 chip on there that's their own silicon. So is there anything else specifically that you were surprised at, either that was present or wasn't present on the board?
I mean, I'm a little sad we've lost the 3.5mm audio jack. As I said already, I'm surprised by the lack of eMMC. I think that will be a point of discussion in the marketplace. It is, the Pi is unusual for not having that opportunity for having eMMC connectivity, either chip on the board or a socket. And I was also a bit surprised, in fact very surprised, there isn't a color-coded GPIO connector.
Yeah.
Because you almost don't see, you don't see any Pi clones now effectively without the color-coded connector. It doesn't cost a lot to put that on. They're a very standard component now. I don't know why that isn't there. That's not a technical issue. That's almost a marketing decision, isn't it, or a design decision, aesthetics decision. The main thing is we have a new Pi. We have something with a lot more power, a lot of possibilities. This is going to push up the SBC marketplace, and that's good for all of us who enjoy SBCs. And I found it very interesting today, first of all, filming this thing and doing all the technical stuff around the edge, and then turning it on. And when you boot it up, and it's like, And I think you forget that sense of a new board, new possibility. You have to sort of start experiencing it, using it, and seeing it, and hopefully people will see from our video content how we engage with it, and that'll enthuse them to embrace the new Pi.
And I think there'll probably be a lot more home NAS servers being built because of the M2 capabilities with the new PCIe, and also the fact that the USB is so much faster as well. That's now got, is it 5 gigabits per lane, per channel, as opposed to...
You can use them simultaneously now, apparently,
yes.
can't you? It's although, of course, most NAS software, if you look at, say, OMV, doesn't allow you to set up a RAID using USB connectors, so actually, so what?
Yeah.
I think the value of the USB simultaneous speed will be people will boot this from somebody connected to one USB 3 connector, and then they'll connect storage from the other one. I think that's going to be the opportunity. But then you do start to ask, why should you have to connect your primary storage via USB 3 to do that, which will be the fastest way of booting this board? I don't know the answer to that question.
So one of the other things that's different about this board is it draws quite a bit more power, doesn't it? Or potentially can draw a lot more power at 5 amps. So you do need
5 amp adapter, yes.
So how does that compare against other SBCs? Is that quite normal?
That's top end. I mean, that's top end. It is very rare to find an SBC which doesn't work with a 5 volt 3 amp adapter. In fact, I haven't seen an SBC until you get through to some of the x86 boards, but ARM-based boards, 5 volt 3 amp is the starting point. I've always been... Often I get boards and I don't have a power supply, and I just use the Raspberry Pi 4 one because it powers everything. And that says it all, that nothing needed more power than that could supply. And so it doesn't mean it's going to be drawing 5 amps all the time, of course, but it is interesting that that's there.
And they have built on that new power management chip that's on there, but that can actively draw more current or less current, kind of negotiated with the power supply itself. So I think there's some intelligent, bit like with say an Apple Mac, when you plug in the cable and it can decide, you're a fast charger, I can pull more power. I think it's that kind of technology that happens behind the scenes. So so it isn't going to draw necessarily that much more power. It depends what you've got plugged in the USB as well, I guess, and on the GPIO headers and all the rest of it. So it's very exciting time, isn't it, to be here?
It is an exciting time.
And it also means that there's going to be perhaps a new generation of chips. So are we going to see a Pi 500? I know Eben likes the pun that is, because he's an Amiga guy, isn't he? He comes from that the BBC to Amiga route, and the Amiga 500 is something that exists. So I think he's very keen to have a Pi 500 based on the Raspberry Pi 5, but also the Compute Module 5. Hopefully we'll see that following along soon, and perhaps potentially a Raspberry Pi 03 that might be based on a slightly newer chipset, perhaps. I know that there's physical challenges with just the size of that, because it's quite hard to fit more things on there. Potentially like the RP1 chip might be a bit of a challenge to put on there, along with the...
And I think also, I mean, the only thing we need on the Pico is more RAM. It's the Pico 2W. Pico 2W is a fantastic little board in terms of processor power, but it is handicapped by the memory. And I think the other thing that your discussion that sort of raises is that this is $60 and $80 at launch for the 4 and 8 gigabyte boards. This is pushing up beyond where the Pi started, where it was the $35 computer. And I think for a lot of people, having the opportunities to buy boards at the lower end of the market does matter as well. I would much rather see if we get a new Zero at some point, they just add a bit of memory and keep the price at $15 and $20 point, rather than adding everything on here and having a much more powerful board that takes it in a completely different price bracket.
So, and I understand at launch that they're having the 4 gig and the 8 gig memory variants of this, but on the PCB you can also see there's a little resistor for 2 gig and 1 gig as well, but not 16. Again, I don't know if there's any SBCs out there with more than 8 gig of RAM, but certainly this seems to be the top end of what's capable on this chip. So I'm not sure we will see perhaps with this generation the 16 gig of RAM or higher.
It is interesting that, isn't it? I asked Raspberry Pi about 1 and 2 gigabyte models, and they said, we don't discuss boards before their launch, which we know they don't, but they sort of said at some point. So I think although having said that, I can't see why you'd want a board with this power with 1 gigabyte of memory.
No.
I think the 2 might be a possibility. But the lack of 16 is strange. I've been looking at RISC-V boards recently with 16 gigabytes of memory on an SBC for not that much different to the price of a Pi 5 8 GB model. So, it's there will be some people who want that. I think 8 is enough for most of the things you do with an SBC. But
I think there's something psychological as well about going over that sort of £100, $100, €100 mark for the board. That
yes.
might also be you've kind of breached another threshold there where you start thinking, well, this is like, power wise, this is, I understand the same power as a 2015 MacBook Pro. So, we're only a couple of years behind Apple,
yes.
but on a small board, single board computer. So that's quite
amazing,
impressive,
isn't it? This is a big thing for ARM, in terms of ARM power. I mean, it's not like a Mac M1 or M2, but it's a powerful desktop board based on ARM technology.
So well, thank you for taking the time to speak to me today, Chris. I really appreciate you coming onto the channel and being side by side. It's great to meet you virtually in this way as well. So thank you for your time today. And
no problem
at
all.
See you very soon. And subscribe to Chris's channel, of course.
Thanks very much.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and I shall see you all next time. Bye for now.